Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast. We're dropping in with a special weekend episode for you because, would you believe it, we've got a polling question we didn't tell you about quite yet. So stand by for that. You'll hear a bit more from John Curtis on this episode. Plus, later on, you will hear from Councillor Thomas Kerr, who in the last few days defected from the Scottish Conservatives to Reform UK. He represents the Shettleston ward. He was first elected in 2017. He was the Tory group leader on Glasgow City Council. He'll tell us why he has made the move to Reform UK's party, and indeed what they stand for as we continue our pursuit of Reform UK's Scotland policies. All of that to come. Geoff Aberdein is here, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good evening.
And Andy Maciver is here, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Hello, good evening.
We are recording on Friday evening because that's just how cool and rock and roll we are. Let us, first of all, I actually just want to take a minute because it's been a busy couple of weeks in the pod and we've not had a kind of sit-down little post-match debrief on John Swinney and Kate Forbes appearing together on this podcast 2 weeks ago now and setting the news agenda on fire for several days as well. Geoff, your reflections, I suppose, on what we learned from a rare joint sit-down conversation with the First Minister and Deputy First Minister.
Yeah, firstly, a little bit on just the occasion and then a little bit about the policies and what we discussed. I thought the dynamic between the two of them was really, really intriguing. And it was clear that they hadn't done that before because, you know, I mean, perhaps you can't see it if you're a viewer or a listener, of course, but they kept looking over each other, you know, trying to look for cues as to when to speak. I thought it was quite interesting. So it struck me as it's a very professional business relationship they have, but are they personally that close? I think they're certainly attempting to become that and present themselves as that. But that was quite an interesting dynamic, and it'll be, also interesting to see if that develops going forward. On the substance of what we learned, I thought that, the First Minister got a little bit tetchy with me on two occasions. The one on energy, of course, and I understand that, but he must have known I was going to ask that. But the one that really was quite revealing was on the Scottish Social Attitude Survey on the performance or the viewed performance of the government from the public on key issues. So I thought he didn't quite like it when I was saying, look, you're underperforming, guys, and you need to become more competent to be confident of victory. Surely that has to be a focus. And then we had our poll out just this week. I know we're going to come on and talk about that in a second, but actually confirms the Scottish Social Attitude Survey. I mean, improving living standards for people on low incomes, improving your own standard of living, setting the right level of income tax, supporting economic growth, all of these issues, NHS, education, massive deficits in terms of people being dissatisfied with the Scottish government. That's still very, very relevant ahead of 2026. And if I was Anna Sarwar, when all kind of routes to Holyrood might look closed to me right now, that's the bit I'd be focusing on.
Andy, what did you take away from the sit-down?
Well, lots of things, actually. Let's, at a basic level, I think that whatever political party you support, we should be pleased that we have two people of substance and intellect doing this job. This is an important thing. We haven't always had it, and we've got it, and that's good. I thought one thing that has stayed with me a little bit, Geoff was talking about when the First Minister pushed back a bit on something that he said about Social Attitude Survey. The one area where they both pushed back a little bit on me was when I suggested to them that, broadly speaking, people were pretty calm that they had two good people in the office. But at the moment, largely, the only difference had been in words and not in action. And when you get out there on the streets, what's actually different? Are the queues in the NHS any shorter? Is the education that kids are getting in schools any better? Are there any fewer potholes in the roads? Is tax less? And I think the answer to those questions is no. Everything's the same on the ground. I mean, they've been in for less than a year, so it wasn't a criticism as such, but they've been in for less than a year. And I think, largely speaking, people's lives are not better yet. They might get better because the intention is there and it was a better budget and they clearly know what they're doing a bit more. They might get better, but I don't think they have so far. And I thought that was an interesting pushback because they basically said, oh yes, people's lives are better on the ground. People notice the difference. Now, I suppose in a sense, I hope they don't oversell that internally and become complacent because they're not there yet. You know, people get the fact that they are better. People get that, absolutely. And there is this, and as I've said before, at the school gates and in the WhatsApp groups, and, you know, in normal life, people are calmer and they think this is a better situation. But their lives aren't any different yet. And we've only got just over a year to go to the election, and their lives might not be that different at the election. And the reality is, you know, we're going to talk about polling in a minute. We talked about polling with John Curtis last week as well. The reality is it looks pretty rosy at the moment for John Swinney and Kate Forbes to continue on. But I hope it doesn't lead to any sort of complacency, because right now, life isn't any better just because they've taken control. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah. I think on your first point, Andy, I was thinking about this actually coming up the road after we did the podcast. You know, Anna Sarwar and Jackie Bailey must be cursing the Greens in a sense, and you know, for bringing about, in their view, obviously the Greens would say it was Humza Yousaf's fault, but bringing about the end of the Butte House Agreement, and which obviously led to the departure of Humza Yousaf, because there's no doubt about it, and no disrespect to Humza, the duo of John Swinney and Kate Forbes is a different proposition, and you know, they have, as we have said, steadied the ship. But you know, I can't help but think that this point about arrogance or complacency is so important. Now, I've known John a long time. I don't think he will be complacent. He'll know inside that I've got a hell of a lot of work to do to convince the people to back me. And, you know, on our poll that has been well publicised, I know we're coming to that, just a couple of percent off those, off the SNP lead, and a couple more percent for Labour, particularly in Glasgow and the Central Belt, could change things dramatically. So it really is still all to play for. And so I do think they have to be bold in their vision and be clear and also transparent. The point you make's right, Andy. We ain't going to see massive change in how the way people feel in the next year. That's almost impossible to do in such a short space of time. But if you apply a vision and be quite bold in what you're trying to do, accepting that things haven't been good enough before, that might be enough to see them through in the context of a Labour government which has not really been viewed as performing well at all.
So there's a key point, I think, is this vision thing. I mean, look, we were going to talk, we didn't get a chance to do it, but we talked ourselves behind the scenes, didn't we? We had a laugh about maglev, okay? About this proposed super-fast train line between Edinburgh and Glasgow that the Scottish Government apparently looked at back 15-odd years ago, and that actually I, as the writer of the Tory manifesto, had looked at that point as well. And, you know, you don't have to worry about the fact that it's maglev and it might have been fanciful and so on, but what we sort of reflected on behind the scenes, Geoff and I, when we were having a laugh about it, is it showed a really big vision. And that's missing at the moment. Now, I don't know if we're set up for it. I'm not sure our civil service is set up for it, right? There's a lot of blocking goes on of big ideas by the civil service, to be honest, at the moment, and it's a bit of a problem. I just think that John Swinney and Kate Forbes are in a really good position to come out to the country and say, you know what? Things are not as good for you as they should be. We haven't taken the devolution bull by the horns and really done something big in the last 25 years, and now's the time. Here's the really, really big vision for what we're going to do in 10 and 20 and 30 years' time. This is what this country's going to look like for the rest of this century. I think there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for a politician who does that. That's what people want to hear.
As long as it's credible. And just one side note on maglev, because I remember the cabinet meeting actually, you know, in detail. But I also remember that Alex Salmond was like, okay, they want to do it between Edinburgh and Glasgow, this high-speed rail. And his point was, if it's credible and we could do it, let's do it from Aberdein to Edinburgh through Dundee. Let's do it from Inverness to Glasgow. That was his point. You know, he would connect the whole country. Now, I think John Swinney was finance secretary that time. He's probably going, oh, for goodness sake, I've got to find the money for this. But you're right. I mean, it was a very initial kind of look at things, and there was a lot of work that had to be done to see it through. But, you know, that's the sort of stuff that was discussed back in the day. It might be now, we don't know, because that was issued under the the time sensitive release of these things in the new year. And so maybe they have been discussing something, we won't know. But actually, there was regularly stuff of that greater ambition, and I remember the Queensferry Crossing, for example, different options for the Queensferry Crossing, discussing that at Cabinet. There was a proposal for a bloody tunnel, actually, at the time. I think that was made public at the time. And so there was, these things were really, talked about quite regularly. There was the run-of-the-mill, what you had to do in government, and then, right, what are we trying to achieve? And infrastructure played a big part in that, in those discussions, actually, back then.
Yeah.
Really interesting. You can, of course, still listen and watch, indeed, John Swinney and Kate Forbes. It's available on the podcast feed. Just scroll back if you're listening, or if you're watching, it's on our YouTube channel as well. Thousands of people have watched that and commented on it, so be one of them if you'd like to be. Thanks as well to the Resident Hotel for hosting us. I should just say that this idea of leader and deputy is somewhat catching on, because on the 19th of February, you'll be able to listen to and watch Anna Sarwar and Jackie Baillie with us in conversation, the Scottish Labour and Deputy Labour leader in conversation. The two of them will be looking for some sort of dynamic, some sort of message, some sort of cut through, especially in light of our polling, which we released this week, which hundreds of thousands of people have engaged with over the last couple of days. Thank you if you are one of them. It's certainly prompted a lot of conversation. I suppose the summary of the Holyrood voting intention is that the SNP would be the biggest party, but would have some real work to do when it comes to actually forming a government, should it be them. And there's a chance for another party, perhaps the Labour Party, to try to hustle into some sort of coalition arrangement as well. And so we turn to the questions that we didn't tell you about, which are around coalition and who you would support in terms of forming a coalition government at the Scottish Parliament after 2026. We asked, to what extent would you support or oppose a coalition government being formed between the following parties? Let's first of all look at the SNP numbers. So the SNP and Labour, 33% would support that sort of coalition. SNP and Greens, 32% would support that. The SNP and the Lib Dems, 26% would support an SNP Lib Dem coalition. Just as a sidebar, I was interviewing Sir Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, this morning. He was pretty coy about the idea of any Lib Dem SNP coalition. But do you know what I will say about him is he kind of engaged with Scotland in a way that National Party leaders tend to struggle with, and he actually did all right. Then we asked about Labour's options. So, to what extent would you support Labour and the Conservatives forming a coalition government? 21% would support that, 52% would oppose. What about Labour and the Lib Dems? 29% would support that idea, 40% would oppose. And Labour and the Greens, 26% would support that coalition, 45% would oppose. Thoughts coming from Geoff and Andy in the next few minutes, but first let's turn to Professor Sir John Curtis for a bit of a breakdown.
What the poll asks is that it asks people a whole variety of possible combinations that might happen. So the SNP joining up with Labour, the Greens or the Democrats, or Labour joining up with the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, or indeed the Greens. Now, it has to be said, first of all, perhaps unsurprisingly, given that all of Scotland's parties are minorities, that none of these coalition possibilities has more people in favour than against. All of them have slightly more people against. The one amongst the public that in general emerges as the most popular, again, despite what people in Holyrood might think, not surprisingly, is a coalition between the SNP and Labour, because of course these are the two largest parties. And at the end of the day, both Labour, actually more especially Labour, and SNP supporters, on balance, though sure it's on balance, are more in favour of such a coalition happening than being against. So far as their voters are concerned, not impossible. Now, it has to be said for the SNP, perhaps not surprisingly, they would prefer the deal to be done with the Greens. They got 51% in favour of that, as opposed to 41% for Labour. Oh, and by the way, despite their treatment under Humza Yousaf, Green voters are really keen on the idea. 80% of them would be willing to back such a deal. So to that extent, at least, you can see how the SNP could potentially contemplate either a coalition with their big rivals, and their big rivals couldn't necessarily rule it out as far as their supporters are concerned, or reverting back to the Greens. We talked in the podcast a few days ago about a deal between the SNP and the Liberal Democrats. That's not so popular with SNP voters. They're almost split 50-50 on it. But again, intriguingly, it's not necessarily anathema to Liberal Democrat supporters. Nearly a half of them are in favour of the idea, just under 30% against. So they're also, I mean, in the end, forming a coalition, what crucially matters is not what the public in general thinks, it's what do the people who voted for these parties think. None of these coalitions would be without resistance amongst the party supporters, but they wouldn't necessarily be entirely short of a fair wind either. What about the other possibilities? Labour voters certainly, for the most part, do not want a coalition with the Conservatives. Surprise, surprise. They're clearly on balance against that. And, you know, Conservative voters themselves were only just slightly in favour. So the Conservatives still look uncoalitionable, which has been one of their fundamental problems at Holyrood for the last quarter of a century. Going back to the Labour-Liberal Democrat coalition of 1999 to 2007, Liberal Democrats, 77% in favour of that. So Liberal Democrats more in favour of a deal with Labour than they are with the SNP. But Labour supporters, again, as keen on this idea as they are as a deal, well, actually slightly more keen on this idea than they are a deal with the SNP. So if the numbers were to work, that's probably a relatively easy coalition to form so far as supporters are concerned. Labour and the Greens, not impossible. The Greens aren't so keen on that, only around a half of them in favour. Labour supporters only around 45% in favour, but again, not impossible. So Labour, Liberal Democrat, the easiest to form, but they may not have the numbers. SNP and Green, relatively easy to form. Maybe they will have the numbers. But the unthinkable of the SNP with the Unionist Party, well, not entirely to be dismissed.
John Curtis, as ever, offering his wisdom on the polling. Geoff, the unthinkable, SNP and Unionists gathering together to govern Scotland. What do you reckon?
Yeah, look, it's a long shot in this particular cycle, I think, because you're going to see the next 14 months of Swinney and Sarwar, Labour and SNP going at each other's throats for primacy in this contest. And to think that they might forge a coalition thereafter is somewhat unlikely, unless the rise of reform is to such a degree that there could be some sort of coalition between them and the Conservatives. I think that's the only thing that would spark an SNP Labour get together in Holyrood. But going forward, you know, it shouldn't be out of the realms of possibility, apart from one thing: independence and the position on that. And that's what would have to be resolved. Could you have a situation where you said, well, Labour can vote against any efforts on that respect, in which case would SNP voters swallow it? All of these things are very, very difficult to see. The only way I can see this happening in the next election cycle, post-2026, is as if I say reform have made such significant inroads that it has to happen to stop them from having any potential say in government. Mm-hmm.
So, I think this is a possibility, okay, and not just a nationalist unionist coalition, but an SNP Labour coalition. I think it's a possibility, and the reason I think it's a possibility is this: firstly, Geoff's point about independence is absolutely bang on, right? That is a real blocker. However, most of the polls at the moment will report that the SNP and the Greens between them, and I don't mention the Greens from a coalition point of view, I purely mention it from the point of view of parties that support independence. The SNP and the Greens between them, in most polls, are less than 65. If there is no majority in the Scottish Parliament for pro-independence parties, there's no referendum for 5 years. There's not even a discussion about it, because they can't even pass legislation in the Scottish Parliament, let alone Westminster giving them powers to hold one. It is 100% off the table if there's no nationalist majority. So let's just, for the sake of this argument, presume that's the case, which the polls say it will be. So you put that to one side. And then this is where Geoff's reform point comes in. Okay? Look at Germany and look at Ireland. Why did Merkel go into coalition, the Grand Coalition, with the SPD? It was to lock out the East German communists, who were big enough to cause a problem. And the two big mainstream parties got together and said, they are unacceptable, we can't have them in government, so for the sake of the country, we've got to get together. Why did Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael go into coalition together in Ireland? To lock out Sinn Féin. They are their big mainstream parties coming together to lock out the unacceptables. Look at the polls. How do you put together a coalition with only two parties? Really difficult in a lot of polls, unless those two parties are the SNP and Labour. Now, maybe the SNP and the Lib Dems, but it's pretty narrow. The SNP and Labour, 75, 80 seats, a really, really strong majority, no issue with the Tories, no issue with reform, no issue with the Greens, who, let's face it, I mean, the numbers are the numbers, but behind the scenes, we all know the Greens are never getting back into government. Okay, nobody wants the Greens back in government with them because of what happened the last time, and that includes the SNP. Maths, politics, this is not out of the question, guys.
Absolutely fascinating. Andy, can I ask you what you said there about the Conservatives, uncoalitionable? It's been their problem for 25 years. Is there anything they could do to make them appealing as kingmakers?
Yeah.
Well,
so not be the Conservatives.
They're uncoalitionable. Nice use of the English language there. To everyone, probably apart from reform. Now, I this is where I think I want to see a lot more data and a lot more polling and a lot more by-elections to see where are reform taking their votes from. Are they taking it in equal measure from the Tories and Labour? Is it a bit more Labour? Is it a bit more Tory? Right now, I think the evidence suggests the latter, particularly in England, although there's some examples where that's a lot more closer call. That's the only way I can see a Tory party having any attempt at coalition. Whether Russell Finlay would want to or not is another matter, but the opportunity to govern, to be in power, but together, but the SNP, I mean, so not the SNP, the Conservatives plus reform wouldn't be enough.
Are going to constitute like 1/4 at the most of the parliament. So
Andy, I agree. Look, I think it's, that's why we're focusing on SNP Labour. But you cannot ignore the rapid rise of reform. Again, I say, with no party infrastructure, no known quantities in terms of leadership candidates might be changing. I know we're about to talk to Thomas Kerr, but for goodness sake, we can't ignore this rapid rise. If that continues, all bets are off. I don't think necessarily it will continue, but we live in strange times politically. And it'll be interesting to see what transpires in this respect.
Let me just address your point, though, Calum, that John made about the Tories being uncoalitionable, because it's a point that is relevant with the rise of reform, but it's a point that has been relevant for the last quarter century, as John said. We should be very clear about the fact that Scotland is just about the only country in the democratic world where there is no party of what would be called the traditional centre-right that can make it into government.
Yeah.
It's the only one. There is no other. Even if you look at countries that we see as being quote-unquote left-wing countries, like the Scandinavian countries, the centre-right party are in power in these countries just as much as the centre-left party. We're the only country where that is not acceptable. And it's not because we don't have any time for that ideological foundation. We do. The problem is the messenger, not the message. What we don't have time for in Scotland is the Conservative Party. And when you're in a proportionally representative parliament, and the only way for you to be in government is to have friends, if you don't have any friends, and if all the other parties in the parliament are sworn against ever working with you, you can't ever get into government. And if the point of politics is to get into government, there is no point in the Conservative Party.
Guys, thank you very much for that. Your thoughts on the polling, by the way, very welcome. Your thoughts on what you have heard over the last couple of weeks, whether that's John Swinney, Kate Forbes, John Cursis, all of the above, very, very welcome. You can email us, of course, The email address is hello@holyroodsources.com if you'd like to get in touch there. Or while you're listening, you can WhatsApp on your phone as well. The number to get in touch on WhatsApp is 0333 404 6507. Coming next on the podcast, Reform UK's latest councillor, the only Reform UK councillor in Glasgow City Council. He's just defected, and Thomas Kerr is on the podcast next. Let's go on then. We want to discuss the Scottish Conservative Group Leader on Glasgow City Council, who is no longer the Scottish Conservative Group Leader for Glasgow City Council. Thomas Kerr has defected to Reform UK. He became the Tory Group Leader in 2019. He says that he's annoyed and angry with the Conservatives, and he's here to tell us more. Thomas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Good to see you. Can I start, first of all, by asking, I read a report that you defected in the middle of a meeting. Is that how it happened?
It was indeed. In fairness, the timing was not within my gift. It was supposed to be after the meeting that this was supposed to happen. So the joys of politics, so it ended up like an episode of The Thick of It, where halfway through the meeting I seen Labour councillors look at me very smarmily, and then SNP councillors look very agitated, and I thought there's something going on here. And I looked at my phone to have messages from former colleagues saying what the hell's happened, and I thought, oh God, here we go. So it had been released sooner than I had anticipated on yesterday morning.
Right. Released by the party, do you mean?
So it had been given to the press as an embargo that it was going out, but one of the journalists that got it hadn't been embargoed, and they could run it early, which then created chaos with everything else. So the joys of modern
honestly
politics.
can't believe a political party press office cocking something up. I just simply don't believe it. I've never experienced this before.
I had to plan in my head as well. I could be up in my office away from all my other colleagues, not having to look at the eyes, and no, instead I got the whole shebang. So the joys of Glasgow City Chambers, sitting next to the Green Councils, I might say as well. So that was great fun.
I'm sure. Well, what was it like then, as you're sitting there and the news is leaking, basically, and you're among council colleagues? How do they start responding to you?
It was interesting. I mean, I think that there had been chatted in the chambers this week that something was going to happen. You know what politics is like, you know. So I think there was chatted in the chamber something was going to happen. I don't think anybody expected it to come quite as suddenly as it did. It was nervous, but then a lot of these people, I've been a councillor now for nearly 8 years, so a lot of these people I know, I count some of them as friends, whether they count me as friends now, I don't know. But, you know, we've had coffees and things like that, so it wasn't that was nerve-wracking. It was more the idea that, you know, I'd been in the Conservative Party for 14 years, and knowing that this news had broke, I knew some of the reaction I was going to get from some of my former colleagues and things. That was more the nervousness that kicked in rather than actually around the committee chambers. And to be honest with you, I knew that the politics would kick in very quickly with the SNP and the Greens and Labour and all that sort of stuff. I don't blame them. I'd have done the exact same thing. That's politics, sadly. But yeah, it was more knowing that outside the city chambers, everything was going to be chaotic. Yeah. Sorry, just 2 seconds before I do, I just want to check that I've just been having a nice meal with my fiancée, and I had a glass of wine, and I just wanted to make sure, Thomas, that if I had it, that wouldn't cause any offence or any accusations of being unprofessional or anything, would it? Absolutely not.
Thank you very much. Cheers. I'll just check.
I'm now a reform councillor. You can have as much alcohol as you like.
Thank you.
I'm not worried about asking Andy and Calum's permission, but I just thought it'd be good to check with our guest. Look, you're going to get all these these claims and accusations at you. I mean, I was very interested that in the 28th of June, or in the summer, I think it was last year, you said that Reform UK currently has candidates who are anti-monarchy, pro-independence, and apologists for Vladimir Putin. Be careful what you vote for, Scotland. So what's changed, Thomas? And are Reform UK still apologists for Vladimir Putin? I think in fairness, you know, I could have easily deleted every single social media post I'd ever made. I didn't want to do that because I wanted to make the point as well that, look, over the past year, Reform has remarkably professionalised. They have got themselves together. They have changed the party entirely. Would I have joined last June? Absolutely not. That wasn't the party that I would have joined at that time, but they have professionalised in a way that I didn't expect either. So under Nigel and under Zia, they've done a fantastic job in making sure the party is much more professional, much more slick. They can get rid of all this sort of stuff. They have a more clearer platform. So I feel a lot more comfortable. So yeah, at the time, the key word in that tweet is currently. At that point, they currently had that. I feel very confident that that's not the case anymore. And I think the other thing is, to anybody who's worried about it, I don't think anybody would ever doubt my unionist credentials or my support for the monarchy and that sort of stuff. I feel comfortable enough in myself to look at Reform and got to where I am now. So
these things happen in politics. Last June, I was standing in the general election as a candidate for the Conservatives. You say stuff about other parties. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff that other people have said before they defected that came back to bite them.
Which leads to the follow-on question: have you actually confirmed or not if you're standing in Holyrood next year on the list for reform, or even for a constituency for the reform?
No,
UK party?
there's been I've seen all these accusations tossed about. There's been absolutely no conversations between me and Reform whatsoever about Holyrood in 2026, none whatsoever at all. I made this decision because I've been angry with the Conservative Party for a number of months now, since the general election. Really, I think that they've kind of left behind a lot of the communities that I'm elected to represent in East End and things, and we've been told we have to go and focus in key seats and key areas and things like that. So I was angry for quite some time. I've not spoke to Reform about 2026. As I said before, we had a chat, I've got a 2-year-old son. I'll weigh up how I think things are next year before I make any decision. And I've seen all these sort of accusations, so I get it. But at the end of the day, if I was politically ambitious, I would not have joined the Conservative Party at age 14 in East End of Glasgow. It is not a smart political move for me to do. I've done it because I care.
Well, let me say, I share your sympathy with having a 2-year-old, by the way. I know you're going through there. Would you like to stand up? I mean, if the opportunity arose, is it something that you'd like to consider for Holyrood in 2026?
I've stood for Holyrood twice now for the Conservatives, so I've got ambitions to go in there to do stuff. I'm in politics as a young person who cares about the communities that I came from. If I can make any sort of difference, wherever that is, of course I would like to do that. It doesn't mean I've had conversation. I've not made any decision on where I'm doing next year whatsoever. I may set the next election up. I'm still only 28, although I don't look at this as what Glasgow City Council does to me. But I'm still particularly quite young, so I've still got time on my side on what I want to do politically longer term. But of course, if I was to sit here and say to you, I don't want to be in politics in Holyrood, you would laugh at me, because that's not the case whatsoever. But I have made no decisions whatsoever about what I'm going to do next year.
Thomas, you'll remember it must have been June, I guess, May or June, I chaired a Scottish Federation of Housing Associations panel in Glasgow that you were the Tory representative on. And, I think if anybody had been there that day listening to you on the panel and the others who were on the panel along with you, you sounded extremely mainstream. I would say you're a kind of, I guess a bit of a classic blue-collar West of Scotland Tory. And that's what I think you've probably always been presented as. Whether you present yourself as that, I don't know, but I think you've always been presented as that. I think that there's an interesting potential development in Reform, and I just wonder what you think of it. I mean, do you consider Reform to be a mainstream political party? And you can take the word mainstream any way you want it, but is Reform mainstream?
Yes, I think they are. I think that what's happened, and it goes back to what I was saying about last June, I think what we've seen in the past years is Reform is becoming a much more mainstream centre-right political force in British politics. I think at some point they will likely be a serious threat to the Conservatives across the whole UK. They're already shown they're a serious threat to the Scottish Conservatives because they're offering something different now. I had there was a loads of conversations. I remember being the Holyrood Sources leadership hustings for the Scottish Conservatives. There was loads of conversations about what the Conservative Party should do. The reality is people in Scotland are fed up with this attitude of vote for us to stop someone else. That seems to be the only policy that the Conservatives have. And by the way, it's the only policy that Labour and the SNP have used as well, is vote for us to stop the Tories or vote for us to stop this and that. I think people out there want some sort of vision, and I think that's what Nigel Farage and Reform are offering, is some sort of positive vision as to what the country should look like. And I think they are becoming a much more mainstream party. They're much more to, the centre-right way of thinking. I wouldn't have joined them if I thought this was a fringe party full of loonies. It's not. This is a party that you're seeing as much more professional, much more slick, and knows what they're doing, and I think they can be a serious threat in Scottish politics to get us back to the things that I care passionately about, which is centre-right values.
So I tell you what's interesting, right? I heard you on Radio Scotland on Thursday night, and I had a little look at the transcript, and you said something I thought that was really interesting about Russell Finlay, because Russell Finlay, I think, has presented himself. I mean, there's the sort of common sense agenda, but Russell Finlay, in my book, has tried to move the Tories a bit further towards the reform type of agenda, okay, to try to appeal to the kind of the person in the street who's been forgotten about by mainstream politicians and by centre-left governments. And I think that's where Russell Finlay is trying to head. You said the problem is the Scottish Conservative Party behind the scenes. Russell is not in charge. People who run the Scottish Conservative Party will not allow Russell to bring the changes that this country needs. I thought that was a really interesting comment. Do you think that Russell Finlay himself is nearer where you are and nearer where Reform is, but the establishment of the Scottish Tory party is not and isn't letting him go there. Is that what you're saying? Do you think Russell is a bit more like you and a bit more like Reform?
I think what Russell presents is definitely much more where I am and where Reform is now. I take Russell like he's at. I think Russell's a really nice guy and I think he sells the right message. But as I said in that is in the BBC, the problem that Russell has is the people behind the Conservative Party will not allow the sort of changes that the party needs to then be able to take a vision out to the country. So I do think that Russell presents.
So should Russell join Reform as well? I mean, are you looking at a guy like Russell and thinking, why is he not in Reform?
He's more than welcome. I'm sure we would love to have Russell on board. But no, look, there's a serious point here, and it was frustrating me during the Conservative leadership contest because everybody was tinkering around what they wanted to actually say, which was there was a stitch-up that was going on in the leadership contest that existed in the Scottish Conservatives, and it existed for a long time in the Scottish Conservatives. So people who run the party and who ran the party for a long time who wanted to pick their candidates to do stuff. Russell was the latest candidate. Now, he's saying the right things, but I have no doubt in my mind that people who are behind the scenes are not going to let Russell be able to do the stuff he has to do. And if you see what's happened since he became leader, you can see that, he's a central belt MSP who spends a lot of time in the North East and in the borders pretending that he's a farmer. That sort of thing is not what we're going to do to appeal to the central belt. So I think that you're already seeing this party falling into the same traps as before. Focus in the North East, focus in the border, stop in the F2, we can beat the SNP. And that rhetoric just won't cut it anymore.
I actually think there's a lot to be said for your analysis there. I mean, I'm not a Tory, so I'm not sure many people listen to me for my views on Conservative Party politics, but I actually think that last point is very important about the geographical focus and on the messaging, and it's something we've discussed on this podcast before. Can I ask then, Thomas, like, is you mentioned you've been in the party 17 years, that's stalwart status despite your relatively young years. Are there others within the party feeling the same as you? And do you think there's going to be other defections in the run-up to 2026 from the Conservatives to Reform?
I would be surprised if there wasn't. I know there are people who are unhappy and who are angry. What I've said to every single person who's spoken to me over the past 48 hours since I made this decision, and I've had members, I've had councillors contact me, I've had even some MSPs contact me, and what I've said to them all is you have to get to that decision yourself, because it took me 3 months to get to where I am. As I said, I've been in the Conservative Party a long, long time. I grew up in the Conservative Party. It's like a second family to me. It's not a decision you take lightly, but I think there's also another paradox here. I don't think we're going to see just defections from Conservatives. I've spoke to a number of people who I'm close with in the Labour Party who are fed up and angry as well. I think that this is a movement that could really transform Scottish politics as well as British politics, and that's what's making me excited about it.
Yeah, I just want to say, because I think Calum had his New Year's resolution and his prediction, and he said he thought that there would be in 2025 a Reform UK MSP. Now, we kind of poured a bit of scorn on him, meant to be the experts, Andy and I, and now I'm actually wetting myself that he's gone and called it right.
Andy's already predicted Russell, so there you go. We're one close.
That would be a huge one.
But serious question. I mean, did you think an MSP be it?
I don't know. I've spoken to MSPs, not about defecting. I've spoken to MSPs about the decision I have made, and they've been very supportive.
Wow.
I don't know is the honest answer, but do I think as time goes on and the Conservative Party starts to retreat back to the same old message that some people will say I've had enough, then yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. But as I said, I don't think this is just an issue for the Conservative Party. I think Anas Sarwar has been extremely complacent about the issue that Reform's going to cause as a threat to him. I think other parties need to wake up to this. This is not just an issue for the Conservative Party. I'll give you an example. In the Glasgow North East by-election, which took place in November, Reform got 18% of the vote. Now, I remember one of the Labour councillors turned to me and said, what are you going to do about Reform leading into your vote? And I said, we never had 18% of the vote in Glasgow North East. This is not Conservative voters that are switching. 1 in 5 Green voters second preference Reform in that by-election. There is a phenomenon out there of people who are sick, fed up with the party system and who want something different, and Reform is offering that. So, yeah, there might be an MSP that could come from the Conservatives, but I would not rule out some other party jumping in here as well.
That's fascinating.
Just a brief point on that, and not to get too deep into the ideology because it's probably for another time, but I do think that the political bubble still looks at politics as being right and left. It's not anymore. Right? It's not anymore. Politics is now about, are they for me or are they not? And I think that's why you're seeing Reform being able to take votes from the Tory party and from Labour. It doesn't matter about right and left. It's about, have they forgotten about me? Are they interested in me? Have they got any idea what my life is like? So in the bubble, we're thinking about politics as being an ideological battle, but it isn't. Out on the streets, that's not what it is anymore. And I think that's where the mainstream parties are not getting what's going on here.
No, I agree with that analysis. I think that's bang on. I think it's easy for politicians, particularly in Holyrood, which becomes a bit of a bubble, where, you know, it's good to have an ideological debate about left or right. But the reality is, for many communities in the Central Belt and in Glasgow and other places across Scotland, they feel as if they've been left behind. They don't have the luxury of having a debate about ideology. They just feel as if their community has been torn apart. They've got politicians who promise stuff at elections and then don't deliver. They feel fed up and left behind. So they're not looking at right or left, they're looking at right or wrong and who they think is the right person that's going to stand up for them. And I think that's what Reform's tapping into, and I think it's really, really exciting for Scottish politics.
I think one thing that we've been working on, Thomas, in the last couple of months as we've been discussing Reform UK and their role in Scottish politics, this evolving role, is actually what they stand for, and to try to pin down a Reform UK policy of basically any kind. And I'm just wondering what you would hold up as the Reform UK policy that tipped your decision.
Well, you could look at the contract that they had last year, which was part of when I was spending time over Christmas looking at what I was planning on doing politically. Because over Christmas, I had the mindset I was leaving politics entirely because I was so scunnered with a whole lot of politicians. So I was leaving entirely until I started to look at Reform, having spoken to family and friends and other people. And when I looked at the contract from last summer, one of the policies that really stuck out was their economic argument, particularly through tax. This sort of stuff is the things that would actually help aspirational workers. Now, in terms of Scottish politics, they will have to evolve their manifesto. I'll tell you what was one of the turning points for me, though, was seeing at their conference, the speakers that they had on the stage were not politicians. You know, they had people like Anne-Marie Ward from Favour UK speaking because they wanted to hear what her ideas were in terms of policy to deal with addiction. And that's what's exciting about Reform as well, is they want to listen to the experts and come up with a manifesto pledge and promise that actually works and has been delivered by experts. That's exciting as well. So, you know, I think some of the economic arguments, I think some of the stuff on net zero is stuff that I fully back up on. You know, if you look at Glasgow in particular with the low emission zone, too many politicians like to lecture people rather than actually
So on net zero, Reform UK's take is the push for net zero is coming at the detriment of people, basically.
It's harming constituents like mine in the East End of Glasgow. We lost 400 taxi drivers last summer because of Glasgow's low emission zone, when that could have been delayed for a year to make sure those taxi drivers could have retrofitted cars, because politicians were too dogmatic to look at it in a pragmatic way. I'm not saying I don't back trying to tackle the climate emergency, I'm not saying this, but when you have these arbitrary targets put on stuff and say we have to make this, what you're doing is you're going to make the country poorer and you're going to make people poorer, and you're not bringing the public with you. You need to bring the public with you in all this stuff. And I think that's where politicians have got to completely backwards.
Mm-hmm. So if I may just tease out one thing before you go on, Calum, because on the net zero thing, you know, I get criticised by some for being a defender of oil and gas, but I do that for pragmatic reasons, because I believe you need to protect the supply chain. And I get a bit concerned when I'm listening to some in Reform UK. I'm not sure if they're spokespeople or not, and this is the point about your infrastructure yet. I'm not really sure what relation they are to Reform UK. They certainly talk about Reform UK in favourable terms, saying, you know, the wind doesn't work, we can't do that, that's a load of nonsense, you know, a bit Donald Trump, you know, the windmills when he work. I'm really concerned about that, because there is a massive economic opportunity in renewable energy, particularly in offshore wind, and linked to that green hydrogen. So I know, Thomas, you're new in the door, but are you going to be an advocate for ensuring that we do green industrialise our country, we do support the acceleration of offshore wind? I mean, I think that's important to understand.
Well, I think my job is to make sure that I can move Reform to a position where I think they can become a party that is serious about trying to open up economic prosperity. And if that's through green industry, if that's through other industries, and I'm happy to do that. Now, I'm happy to say, Geoff, unlike other politicians, I am not an expert when it comes to wind and when it comes to energy policy. It's not something we normally deal with in Glasgow, I must admit. I don't get many windmill or wind farm applications at planning committee. So it's not something I personally deal with quite a lot, but the exciting thing about Reform is that the policy platform is going to be created by people who are experts in the industry. And my hope is that would be from all different industries when it comes to the energy policy.
Yeah, but you do know that, I mean, look, Strathclyde University, great example, Professor Jim Macdonald. I mean, a lot of energy tech is going on, a lot of R&D is going on to support this. I think people think this is a North East issue or a Highlands issue. This is a potential transformation of our economy if we get this right. It has to be a managed transition, of course. But I really hope that if you're in a position of influence in 2026 or indeed in the general election thereafter, that we don't, abandon that opportunity. I really hope we don't.
Well, as I say, I'm only 48 hours in the door. I don't have that much influence.
Well, I'm leaving it to you. It's on you to
try.
sort, okay?
Just a couple of final thoughts, Thomas. You've been very generous with your time. I want to ask whether you feel, or fear, perhaps a better word, whether you fear that you forfeited all power and influence on Glasgow City Council by becoming a Reform UK councillor by defection. You're off committees. We've already talked about the response from colleagues. Where does that leave your constituents?
I ever had any influence in Glasgow City Council.
You did.
That
you did.
fills
You were
me with joy.
You were the Tory group leader. You were on committees.
But the reality was, I sat on committees because there was proportionality in terms of seats. We had 2 Conservative councils, so they sat us on seats. My vote was pretty meaningless because the SNP Leeds have numbers to do whatever they want to do, and Labour couldn't vote with us because we're the big bad evil Tories with their attitude. So my influence is very limited to start with. Actually, what the SNP and the other parties have done is given me a bit of a free rein to go and spend a lot more time out of the city chambers and talking to the punters on the street, so I'm quite thankful for it. I think it's petty partisan politics, to be honest with you. I spent 8 years in these committees. I think I'm one of the longest serving. I sat on the City Administration Committee, which is the main body committee, from my very first day as a councillor up until last week when I was kicked off it. So they've kicked out someone who's got experience because they want to play politics. That's fine, that's politics. I'd have done the same thing if somebody had done the same thing. That's how it works. But I think that it's going to be their own detriment because I can spend a lot more time in shelters and talk to the punters and getting the reform message out. And as I said to the press over the past couple of days, I am very confident I will be back on those committees with a much bigger reform group, and politicians who try to silence me may have a bigger issue to deal with when there's a lot more councillors than just me there.
Really interesting. Thomas, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us.